Thanks for the intro and thanks for coming, everybody. We're super excited to be here. Yes, as C said, my name is Frances Corry. You'll see the word Frances on official documents. Anyways, in conversation, feel free to call me Franny. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Information Culture and Data Stewardship in the School of Computing and Information at the University of Pittsburgh. So we're really looking forward to talking with you all today about a phenomenon that we've been playfully calling social media's midlife crisis, and a qualitative study of public discourse that we've done to sort of understand this moment in social media's history. So before we tell you exactly what we mean by midlife crisis, we thought it would be helpful to kind of explain how we got here, to tell the story of this research, and kind of how we entered into these conversations in the first place. As we'll get into, Chelsea and I are both social media researchers who approach the intersection of technology and society from different but complementary lenses. So we're going to talk a little bit about our individual research. We'll then talk about some of the discourse that we kind of saw in the wild that prompted this study in the first place, and that led us to do concerted work on how people are conceptualizing social media in the present era. Then we'll dig a little bit into literature about media narratives and social media narratives before we get into the findings of our study, where we engaged in a qualitative analysis of public discourse about emerging platforms, including TikTok, Be Real, and Threads. And we'll talk a little bit about some of our findings, and especially some of the things that surprised us the most as we analyzed this discourse, especially the ways, like, spoiler alert, the ways that the future of social media is sort of refracted through this lens of the past and this lens of memory. And then we'll get into some of the directions we're hoping to go after this study. And with that, I'll pass it off to Chelsea to tell you about the research.
Trying to stand in a place where I will not be in the way, but
the corner.
Figuring out the best place. So, hi everyone. I'm Chelsea Butkowski, an assistant professor of data, media, and identity in American University School of Communication. I personally think that is the coolest title ever, so I'm pretty excited about it. So I use a mixed methods approach to study the relationship between media technologies, identities, selfhood, and specifically focusing on gender and sexuality. So to begin showing you what I mean here, this slide displays a few facets of my so-called digital identity. On one side, I have a couple of my social media profiles. I have my LinkedIn, I have my Twitter, or X, if you will. And the way that I choose to manage these two profiles, sure, it might look a little bit different on LinkedIn versus Twitter, but they reflect choices I make in conjunction with platform features and interfaces to share my life online. But on the other side, I have a few of the ways that platforms have come to represent my identity through the trace data that I leave behind, my clicks, my likes, my views, the keywords I use, and more for the purposes of targeted advertising and who knows what, honestly. So Twitter has assigned me a gender. Thanks so much, Twitter. I was a little confused. Also, Meta has decided that I have some very important key interests. These are from a few years ago, but my interests include garage rock, crocheting, okay, as well as lemon, lime, and sleeve. I don't know how to be interested in sleeve. I don't know what they were trying to sell me when they thought I was interested in sleeve, but that's me. This is me, both of these things. So the question here for me is, are the performed and datafied aspects of my online identities in alignment? What does that even mean? To what extent should they be aligned? These are questions I've been thinking about in my research. And my research really operates at the user level of social media platforms, motivated by questions that correspond with these two areas, which I see as very intermingled and aligned. On one hand, how do ordinary users leverage social media platforms to perform and make sense of their identities using and interfacing with various features and interfaces of these platforms, as well as on the other side, how do these same platforms attempt to make sense of their users in return, And how does that shape user experience through data, algorithms? How does that shape the ways that we see and understand ourselves and our identities? My recent work has focused on identities and democracy on social media, considering how people represent their lives online, adapt, and cope during unsettled times. We've certainly had a lot of unsettled times recently, kind of sick of it. We know that the personal social media content that people share during major transitions, disruptive events can be both very powerful and very controversial, as we see in just a few of these selfies here, which have inspired a lot of conflictual discourses online. We've got everything from funeral selfies, natural disaster selfies, masked selfies, selfies taken while storming the Capitol building. We know that the way people place themselves within historic events is powerful, meaningful, yet also complicated. And this is leading up to a book project I'm currently working on, which focuses on the strategies that American social media users have employed to navigate their online identities during the pandemic and kind of the wider pandemic era. So during 2020, 2021, and now in 2024, I've been interviewing 100 social media users to co-analyze their profiles and feeds alongside me on various different platforms. And in doing so, I'm trying to examine how unsettled times can sort of unsettle our digital identities and consider how the strategies that we use to adapt to these rapidly changing circumstances can support our individual and community survival while also creating tensions with widely accepted ideas of identity and selfhood. Last thing I'll say before I turn it back over to Franny is that I'm also interested in thinking about the ways that users respond to change and transitions that happen in the infrastructure of social media, which is what ties me directly to this work as well. Thinking about, for example, Elon Musk changing over the nature of the blue check on Twitter, the ways that platforms identify themselves, brand themselves, create interfaces and features can also potentially affect the way that users are identified, identifiable, and understand themselves. So that's a little bit about my work.
Yeah, and my scholarship, I have to give myself a reminder about what it's about. It's based in information studies, communication, and science and technology studies. I study long-term practices of data management from a critical and qualitative perspective, and especially how choices around long-term data organization and long-term data management impact diverse communities. So I look especially at practices of closing or sunsetting technological systems and actions like deleting data, whether that's in AI systems or in social media platforms or digital rapid response collections. That's sort of a new thing I'm focusing on, and the social consequences of these decisions. So my main project right now is my monograph that looks at the process of closing or sunsetting social media platforms. That project draws on interviews that I did with 50 plus platform employees from sites that have closed, including ones like MySpace. Who's heard of MySpace? Raise of hands. Okay. GeoCities. Okay. Vine. Yes. Friendster. All right. All right. Okay. So we have some knowledge of those platforms. And I ask about the values, the technical, and the economic factors that shaped how platforms shut down, what they do with their user data, delete it, and or sell it, and what's left over of platforms after they close, and how that's going to shape things like community memory practice or historical inquiry into the future. So one of the ways that I came to this research framing around like long-term data management and its consequences was because I was seeing what was sort of like the dominant cultural and scholarly discourse around technology and around social media platforms in particular. And these were discourses that seemed sort of inextricably tied to the new, to the notion of like constant innovation, growth, and production. And the major mental model, especially at the time that I was sort of coming online and engaging with social media platforms, was like growth, like in particular, hockey stick growth. A diagram that, like, when you kind of dig into it, really only seems to tell part of the stories about growth and change of social media platforms. So, like, what happens, here? Like, what happens after this line shoots off the screen? Similarly, I was looking to considerations around data life cycles from within different computing cultures. And these also tended to not consider data's afterlives. So when you look to discussions of the life cycle of data, for instance, in like machine learning training data, the afterlives of this data are rarely considered. So as you can see in this diagram that sort of analogizes a data life cycle that's from a Google course on data analytics, there appears to be no death. So like the larvae becomes caterpillar, the caterpillar becomes a chrysalis, right? That's what that's called. The chrysalis becomes a butterfly, and the butterfly just morphs back into a larvae. But actually something like this happens, which is that the butterfly dies. And I'm sorry, I'm just sorry that that's what happens. So this is to say that like my research asks us to look critically at sort of like consequential but less considered moments of the data management life cycle to sort of widen our temporal horizons that we bring to studying technology cultures, so that we can have a more comprehensive view of information systems, and I think a more accurate view of information systems. And this is a perspective that I brought to the project that we're going to talk about today.
All right. So yeah, as you can see, we come at this from very different kind of sides of the coin when it comes to studying social media. I'm focusing on the user level, Franny's more on the organizational level, but we came together because even with our very different perspectives, we both noticed a phenomenon happening for social media platforms. And at first it was hard for us to put our finger on exactly what was happening, but I want to share with you some evidence to see what you think. We all could possibly agree here that the social media ecosystem has never really been very stable. Platforms are constantly emerging, evolving, aging, and closing, but the last few years have appeared particularly volatile. Major companies like X and Meta have undergone historic transformations. I already mentioned how Elon Musk bought Twitter and enacted radical changes to its brand, its systems, content moderation, user verification, posting features, and many others. We also saw Mark Zuckerberg in 2021 rebranding Facebook to Meta to align with the then future, now unrealized vision of the metaverse. And instead of closing down or falling apart like the big platforms of the past, we see these huge platforms persevering and transforming, sometimes at the cost of users and cultures. But at the same time, we also see a slew of new platforms have emerged in the same time frame. So we've got TikTok, BeReal, Threads, Blue Sky, Mastodon. I'm sure you could name a few more. There have been so many. And it seems that after many years of potentially a somewhat stagnant social media landscape, we're seeing a boom of new platforms, all of which could potentially be the next big thing, whatever that means. But we see this happening in this transition, this discussion happening in newspapers. Some headlines, 2022 was the year social media started eating itself. Social media is entering its flop era. The end of the social network, age of social media is ending. Okay, yes, we get it. We see it among some of our key thought leaders, content creators, and influencers as well. One example, this content creator, Raw Beauty Christie, she's a makeup YouTuber. For some reason, she's also talking about the future of social media, which she has a lot of experience. She's been on YouTube and on social media as a content creator since around 2010. In her video, Why You Feel Dead Inside After 2020, she describes social media as follows. It's sort of like a relationship. We're out of the honeymoon phase. It's almost like we peaked and now we're in the downward shift of social media. It feels like everything was exciting and now everything sucks, with a lot more swearing was originally in this quote. We also even see this in academia. And when we look at places like Harvard University's initiative, the Institute for Rebooting Social Media, immediately I ask, reboot back to what? Where are we going? Where to reboot to? Sounds like a great initiative, but at the same time, all these different sources, academia, the content creators, journalists, seem to be asking different versions of a similar question. What is social media for in today's society, and what does its future look like? They also all seem to be starting to answer this question in a similar way. All of them place social media into some kind of life cycle. Mentions of a flop era, a honeymoon phase, an amorphous ending or rebooting. There's just a lot of speculation about the life of individual social media platforms and social media as a whole, as a construct. So observing all of this, we have come to agree that it appears as if social media companies, the platforms they run, the users they support, they've arrived at this existential juncture. And this juncture is marked by a sense of stagnation, anxiety among both users, thought leaders, and the platforms themselves to and to play along with or think through these life cycles, the relationship life cycle, the human life cycle. We wanted to think about it in terms of this kind of stereotypical life cycle here. And if this is akin to anything, we argue that the current era of social media is akin to a midlife crisis, somewhere around here. So as healthline.com has very helpfully defined it for us, a midlife crisis is a period of soul searching and existential concerns that some people face in middle age. And so we argue, think, and want to use the fun metaphor of the idea that perhaps social media has entered this sort of searching and existential concern of midlife crisis.
So we were interested in understanding the discourses that Chelsea just introduced us to and sort of making sense of this cultural moment. And we decided to do this through a qualitative analysis of popular press about emerging social media platforms, as we said, TikTok, BeReal, and Threads. And we chose to study emerging platforms for two main reasons. For one, press discussing these new platforms was a site where we were seeing these sort of like midlife crisis narratives unfold. So makes sense that they're a good place to study this. And also, we looked at narratives of emergence because as historians of technology and scholars of memory have shown, studying emergence, so like the time at which something comes out and starts being talked about, is a valuable point to identify cultural narratives and cultural debates before discourses about them have totally settled down into sort of like a standardized way of talking about something. So it's kind of like a really ripe place to study discourses. And there's a precedent for studying the stories that are being told about media. So to put the examples mentioned earlier into the context of existing literature, these stories are what communication scholars would call media narratives, or stories about media technologies and media change. So as scholarship from these domains has shown, media narratives are consequential and revealing. They help social groups emotionally and culturally make sense of and assimilate novel technologies and any social changes these technologies are associated with into daily life. Media narratives, as this literature has shown, often some kind of subscribe to these like well-worn but often inaccurate tropes. So for instance, the idea that the emergence of one medium or one technology will replace or destroy another, even though histories of technology prove that that's not cleanly the case. Importantly, media narratives are not only personal means of making sense of media change, but also they serve ideological functions. So narratives are not just like neutral descriptors of what exactly happens, but rather they inevitably support certain social, cultural, economic, political agendas, as historians and scholars of media and platforms have discussed. Social media itself has had particular media narratives associated with it. So we might think back to that like hockey stick graph as like one media narrative that is sort of emblematic of social media and its association with innovation and growth, and kind of constantly moving forward. Media technologies in general are typically kind of like subscribed or sorted into these categories between old and new. And in this sorting, social media has sort of been represented as the quintessential new media technology. Newness is in part disruptive because it's framed as having like no ties to the past. But what happens when these platforms are no longer thought of as new, but instead they're subscribing, as the examples we saw showed, to the sort of existential crises of middle age? However, at the same time, social media narratives also reproduce sort of like older pre-digital media narratives, including that trope of medium replacement as platforms emerge and close, but also prompt moral panics, especially about children's well-being. Okay, and we can look even more closely at the sort of like trajectory of micro narratives about social media. So early narratives about social media, let's say like, early 2000s, lauded the sort of creative and participatory potential as Web 2.0 and platforms debuted. And what these narratives did was help define a new era that was separate from the dot-com crash of the late 90s. So there were kind of like economic reasons that these narratives were being put forth. Going on into the late 2000s, early 2010s, platforms continued to be framed as spaces for egalitarian expression, framed that way by the companies themselves, narratives that supported these platforms' ability to function with few regulations. And finally, moving on towards 2016 and following, a techlash centered around social media platforms sort of began to grow after the 2016 US election, where diverse groups questioned the social, political, and economic, the negative social, political, and economic effects of social media platforms and companies. And we haven't talked about this, but something I was realizing, I was like, this is almost like an 8-year cycle, like 2000 to 2008, like 2008 to 2016, 2016 to 2024. And like our study is 2024. So there's potentially this new era happening. Okay, so, but what about today? Wow. How do journalists construct media narratives about emerging social media platforms today? How do these narratives perpetuate or upset existing narrative tropes that we've been looking at about social media? And what kinds of futures are animated in these framings? And maybe what kind of futures are obscured in these framings too? So that gets into our study itself.
Yes, so this is an ongoing project, which is part of the reason why we're so excited to talk with you all about it and, see the many different perspectives in the room, helping us to continue thinking through how we are analyzing and considering this data and this new era of social media. And so what we did in our current analysis is we engaged in a qualitative textual analysis of international English language newspaper articles about emerging centralized as opposed to decentralized Fediverse social media platforms. So we looked at the first 100 articles published and sorted by this database, ProQuest News and Newspapers, in the first 12 to 18 months of each platform's existence. We've elected here to go with, instead of a wide breadth approach of a more computational analysis, a depth approach of a in-depth immersive kind of reading of the texts. And so we looked at TikTok, which emerged in 2018. This is a short video sharing platform created by the Chinese company ByteDance that has skyrocketed to major popularity in the US and around the world. We also looked at BeReal, which is a French photo sharing platform originating in 2019 that encourages all users to share one photo set from their front and back phone cameras at the same time each day. And then we also looked at Threads, the newest platform, which is a microblogging platform launched by Meta in 2023 in response to users leaving Twitter/X after Elon Musk purchased the platform. And interestingly, we did try to gather the first 100 articles about these platforms in their first 12 to 18 months, but BeReal did not have that many articles, and we have thoughts about why that would be. We'll talk about later on. In terms of our analysis procedure, we engaged in this kind of beautiful little spiral method where we did an inductive analysis of the articles using the platform Deduce, which if you do qualitative analysis is a great collaborative coding platform that is affordable. So highly recommend. This involved deep immersion in the data and an iterative coding procedure that involved periods of immersion, looking back at the literature, going back to the data, coding, and doing multiple levels of coding. First, broad open coding, and then consolidating our codes. We established intercoder reliability through regular discussion and management of discrepancies together. And here is a code cloud of our open code book with a list of our many different codes that ended up coming up. And in order to sum these up for you, let me just describe some of the key themes among these codes. Some of these include platform ideals, as well as dangers and fears. Also, the idea of competing platforms and personalities clashing, big CEOs, business, and platforms drawing from and copying each other, users' experiences of new features and the social media landscape more broadly, as well as we'll get into, questions of memory and nostalgia. And we're actually going to get into it right now. So while we initially expected that our findings would be solely focused on the future of these platforms, including imaginaries about what might be next for social media, what actually emerged from our analysis was more complicated than that. We found that discussions of journalists and technological thought leaders were far more focused on the past. And we came to understand that the media narratives of these emerging platforms were vividly colored by cultural memory. And when we think about memory, if we could think about it as retaining and recalling the past, cultural memory is really more about thinking about how the role of media can be involved in the way in shaping how we recall the past. So cultural memory research really builds on understandings of memory as being formed in social groups, but emphasizes popular cultural discourses and mediated symbolic forms, whether that be literature, photographs, souvenirs, folk art, newspapers, scrapbooks, and even social media platforms in aiding and shaping the way that we construct and understand our memories. And specifically, the formation of cultural memory that emerged within our analysis was an animation of nostalgia, media nostalgia, or the idea of yearning or longing for past media technologies and experiences. And what the memory scholarship has established is that nostalgia within media and technological change is a really powerful, effective modality for coping with change, with coping with instability and confusion. And so the thing that we noticed that was also another layer on top of all of this nostalgia and memory was that in each discussion of the different platforms, the discourses all took nostalgia and placed it and formed it just a little bit differently. So for each platform, we see kind of unique formation of nostalgia happening. And we're going to talk you through each of the three platforms briefly, and then talk about what we take away from all of them. So first, with TikTok, we see this desire for a nostalgic community, a nostalgia for the social media of the past and the feelings, the affective experiences, yearning for what it felt like to be in community on social media at some unknown previous time. This meant fun, glee at the kookiness of the content on TikTok, the ease of use, and the intergenerational appeals. Really that fun, creativity, and connection that can only be offered on a platform that is being used a lot by young people and that is a little bit unregulated and off the rails. But also alongside of this fun kookiness, nostalgia for community, comes the biggest techno-cultural panic that we see among the three platforms. TikTok has inspired a huge amount of cultural panic in terms of fears about danger for children, pornography, addiction, privacy, and all of that has some kind of interrelationship to this kookiness, uniqueness. But when we think about TikTok, we also just, the journalists repeatedly describe this wishing for a past feeling of community and connection. And the interesting thing that happened in this data as well, we sampled from the TikTok data in 2018, early 2018. And at that time, we were seeing two diverging things happening in India and in the US. In our international data corpus, I should say. So in India, they were banning TikTok. It came into the Indian tech sphere, and very quickly there was a decision to ban TikTok countrywide. In the US, there was fear combined with joy, and it was a bit confusing. Now we know in the US, we're also planning to ban TikTok. And these are all in a continuous cycle together. So we see in our code cloud briefly a juxtaposition between themes and codes about TikTok bans, exploiting children, governance and content moderation, with expression, play and fun, kookiness, young people, growth and spread. So there's kind of this juxtaposed narratives going on. But a couple quick quotes to read from some of these articles. An article from the New York Times talks about TikTok as the rarest of internet creatures, a place where people can let down their guards, act silly with their friends, and sample the fruits of human creativity without being barraged by abusive trolls or algorithmically amplified misinformation. It's a throwback to a time before the commercialization of internet influence, when web culture consisted of mainly harmless weirdos trying to make each other laugh. Sounds cute and funny, right? But then also we see this discussion about the fears in the Shanghai Daily at this time, writing that there's caustic comments, potential abuse for young girls, as well as a hunting ground for sexual predators on TikTok.
I was hoping my Be Real would go off during the middle of this presentation, but wouldn't that be perfect? Accounts of Be Real really focused on the features that this application offered, and the sort of unique temporal and social connections that were enabled through these features. And these accounts really argued that because of these affordances, because of these features, we were able to get back to a sort of unvarnished, authentic self-representation, one that was, and they often opposed it to Instagram. Like, Be Real is authentic and fun because, it's not like Instagram where you're curating a very specific kind of shiny version of your life. So we're getting back to authenticity on social media. Unlike what was sort of interesting, and Chelsea gestured to this before, is that, like, unlike the discourses about TikTok or Threads, Be Real, we couldn't even get to 100 articles in those first 18 months of it being around. And so it kind of fell out of favor in social media discourse. And one reason might be that it sort of like lacks this juggernaut company behind it. So, people have beats like reporting on Meta, reporting on Facebook, but Be Real was more of a startup style company based in France, not typically thought of as a giant tech hub. Be Real isn't kind of stopped being talked about after that first year and a half. I'm still on it. So here are some of these first level codes about Be Real. You can see very clearly that authenticity was a huge theme in like all reporting on Be Real. And they also often gestured to social media history when they were discussing the features of Be Real. Sort of basic explanation, which is also a large code that we have here, are these articles just explaining even how Be Real works with that front and back facing camera. Okay, and so here's a quote that kind of embodies what we were finding in accounts about Be Real. This is John Herman in the New York Times in an article. This new photo sharing app is boring in a good way. Be Real markets its experience as a return to rawness and authenticity. But at least to this user, it can feel more gauzy and nostalgic, like a reproduction of the experience of joining one of the dominant social networks when they all still felt like toys. So again, we can kind of like hear these echoes of, so a dominant social network referring to like an Instagram or a Facebook. We can also kind of hear like echoes of the techlash discourse about responding to the techlash here. So prior to the techlash, these things all kind of still felt like toys. But joining one of these new networks, specifically Be Real, like gets us back to that pre-techlash phase when we had sort of a more sunny version or sunny vision of social media. We also analyzed Threads, which is the Twitter competitor launched by Meta as Musk was taking over Twitter. And the theme that we really saw in discourse about Threads was nostalgic success. So all of these accounts you'll see on the next slide were just like dominated by this notion of a competing platform against Twitter and competing personalities between Zuckerberg and Musk. There were lots of mentions of a cage match that was going to happen between the two of them. Just endless coding of the cage match. And So there was really this focus on sort of like a media replacement narrative. There was this trope of media destruction that only one of these two platforms could survive in this environment. Would it be Threads? Would it be Twitter, X? Um, and there was a lot of excitement around a sort of nostalgia for Facebook's sunny days, for its success. Um, like a sort of the rapid growth of Facebook as embodied like in that movie, The Social Network. That Threads was going to be like a new coup for Meta. And sort of Mark Zuckerberg would emerge triumphant again, sort of like after the techlash, people were kind of like rooting for him again when Threads was being introduced. At the same time, there was sort of this undercurrent or trepidation about Meta's baggage, including like, well-known privacy violations and data management things. So as you can see here, competing platforms and personalities was kind of the dominant first level code. So this quote embodies some of this nostalgic success that we were seeing. In the Wall Street Journal, the journalist write, "Is this it? A real Twitter competitor? It sure looks like the closest thing to it. Heck, in just the first 4 hours, it had over 5 million signups, according to Zuckerberg's own thread. The app hit 30 million signups as of Thursday morning," he posted. But as Zuckerberg, or an actor playing him, was once famously told, this is the movie, The Social Network, sort of, 30 million signups isn't cool. You know what's cool? A billion signups. Okay, that might not happen this week, but it's probably what he's aiming for. So we see these like callbacks to the success era of Facebook and this kind of focus on these, that only Twitter or Threads could survive. Okay, so reflecting on these things that we're finding, that we were finding in the analysis of these three platforms, we started to realize like, okay, social media has been coded as this sort of quintessential new media that we saw in those media narratives we were looking at before. But what if its role today, as was coming through these themes, is actually better understood through a focus on the past? So one of the things that we found was there was sort of like an evolution of narrative tropes about the hopes for media and the fears of media that we're calling Hopes and Fears 2.0. So accounts addressing BeReal and TikTok really revisited ideals that were associated with early social media, sort of Web 2.0, that first era that we were talking about in the timeline, including authenticity, connection, and creative expression, that these were sort of returns to that first authentic version of social media. But interestingly, these networks were positioned not in contrast to broadcast media, which is what early narratives like in the early 2000s were showing, comparing like, let's say MySpace to cable television or something, but in contrast to user behavior on long-standing platforms like Instagram or Twitter or Facebook. But also existing fears were repeated, including the sort of never-ending salience of protecting children and fears around the accessibility of pornography on these platforms. But these fears were placed within new, we could say, xenophobic contexts, including children's privacy in the context of an app that was owned by a Chinese company. We also saw, this theme of platform expectancy. So like a midlife crisis in which you're kind of like searching for what's next, media narratives described anticipation for something that was going to like shake up the landscape. Like we need another kind of behemoth to come in and just change everything, disrupt the landscape that we've had. Articles tended to theorize a life cycle with routine signs that indicated the rise and fall of social media, particularly pieces covering Threads as a sort of like killer app for Twitter. At the same time, there was reporting about users that there was like fatigue at the sort of endless options that continued to come up, especially folks who had been on social media since the early 2000s and maybe had been engaged with social media for like 25 years.
Right. And so the last major kind of theme and idea we wanted to talk to you about to wrap this up is this idea that we see coming out of these narratives of nostalgic anticipation. So when we think about nostalgia, we think about a yearning for the past, but when we think about technology and platforms, there's a constant kind of turning wheel of the future, the next big thing. And so within that tension between the past and the future, we see journalists entwined in discussions of everything that is new, refreshing, fun, exciting about these new platforms, with bringing back an older, less corporate version of social media that has a more carefree sensibility, less political, even to the extent where we saw this nostalgia for the past success of a widely maligned platform in terms of Meta and Facebook. And so we think of this nostalgic anticipation that we see specifically animating a technology discourse in contrast to the more well-known idea or existing idea of anticipatory nostalgia, or the sense of sadness we feel about having to leave a beautiful place while we're still there. Like when you're on vacation and you have to go back to work tomorrow and you just already feel nostalgic for your amazing vacation. Instead, with nostalgic anticipation, we see an anticipation of the future through the lens of an idealized version of the past. And the best parts of social media's future as rooted in a yearning for these affective imaginaries and experiences of the past. But to wrap things up, what do we take away from this ever-present nostalgia when we think about social media platforms? We already talked about how media nostalgia can facilitate coping with social change, technological change, these confusions and disruptions, but also in that process, what can it obfuscate? What can it hide? On one hand, it idealizes the history and past of social media, potentially as this place that was fun for creativity, a place where everyone could connect, very democratic. But was it ever truly that? Who knows? Definitely not for everyone. And also, it allows us to maybe this constant move of reinvention, moving to the future, maybe is a chance to move past the techlash. But will it allow us to forget the reasons that social media has fallen out of favor and been widely criticized? And lastly, these platforms know that nostalgia marketing is very successful. The Instagram logo started out as a Polaroid camera, has been increasingly more simplified over time. But we see this kind of nostalgia as a sense of capital, of exchange, of currency, which may be not the best thing for users. While platform expectancy, this constant expectation of new platforms can sometimes work against the fatigue of an exhaustion of these existing platforms and new features and more new things. But as we constantly look for the next thing, the next new feature, the thing that will bring us back to the past and what was originally good about social media, could it potentially make us tolerate more unsavory aspects? And also, who does it end up benefiting? Is it benefiting us as users or designers? Is it benefiting these new emerging companies? Or is it more so benefiting the big juggernaut companies? So social media, is it actually in a midlife crisis? That's a big question. And midlife crises, what even are they? They're social constructions often associated with more of the negative sides of aging. ChatGPT had a few pictures for us, during your midlife crisis, maybe if you're a man, you're going to be near a car, you're going to buy a car, blow all your money, going to a motorcycle, but that sunset is always there in the background. You're going to be sad. If you're a woman, well, you're going to have a glass of red wine. You're going to be in your loft penthouse. You're rich in both pictures, so good for you. And you're going to be staring out the window, sadly, with your shoes and your bags because you've been shopping quite a bit. But it really, when it comes down to it, regardless of whether the midlife crisis is kind of an ageist construct to criticize people as they get older, it does describe how aging and can lead us to search for meaning and reinvent ourselves. And we argue that social media is this communication infrastructure of our time, but also that's important to pay attention to the ways that publics are envisioning the purpose and future of these platforms, that they grow and search for the next big thing. So very briefly, as I know we want to keep some time for questions, in the future, as we continue to develop this project, we want to engage in scholar-to-scholar discussions with those who've researched platforms that have already kind of fallen out of favor with those who are researching new and emerging platforms. We also are planning to and considering comparing these current emerging platform discourses with historical discourses of emerging platforms when they were in their new era, as well as maybe comparing centralized platforms with decentralized Fediverse platforms like Mastodon, and doing research on users and their experiences of platform emergence, this fatigue, whether they also experience some of the same nostalgia. So that is what we have, and we're very excited to chat with you about any questions.